everyone. This is Mr. Gotro, or Mr. G, your instructor for American History 2. We're going to go over the chapter 15, where we talk about consolidating a triumphant union. Hopefully you will be able to find the textbook, Created Equal, A History of the United States, Volume 2. And it starts, we're going to start on chapter 15, where it talks about Reconstruction, which is right after the Civil War. I always inform my students that the South lost the war, but they won the peace, and you'll see what I mean when we go through it. So it's called Chapter 15, Consolidating a Triumphant Union. There was a struggle over the South. How did various groups of Northerners and Southerners differ in their vision of the post-war South and claiming territory for the Union? These are just the highlights. The Republican vision and its limits. What were some of the inconsistencies in and unanticipated consequences of Republican notions of equality and federal power? Well, even though there were a lot of laws that were made in Congress, the National Congress, the South chose to ignore them. And we'll get to that when we talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The key topics in this chapter are Reconstruction and its missed opportunities, 1865 to 1877, the Amendments of Freedom, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Presidential Reconstruction, and the Compromise of 1877. Now, what you're going to hear is about Lincoln's plan, which was the 10% plan, where 10% of all voters in the South in the 1860 election would be allowed to enter the Union again as citizens of the United States, provided that they took an oath of allegiance. Well, that kind of changed after President Lincoln was assassinated. There were wartime preludes to post-war policies, residential reconstruction from 1865 to 1867, the postbellum South's labor problem. There was a perceived labor problem. That's why we start seeing a great influx in immigrants coming to the South, building free communities, and then there was congressional reconstruction, the Radicals' plan. Now, the South was they were completely ruined economically, and there were 260,000 fatalities among soldiers. There was over $2 billion in investment in slaves. Of course, a lot of slaves were freed as the Union armies marched through, and the countryside was in physical ruins. Freed slaves lacked the resources to be self-sufficient. They did. They had no education, and they had no savings or anything like that. And they traveled away from the South to find their families who had been sold into slavery. Republicans, they basically took freed blacks as their mission, so to speak, in order to hurt the South. Republicans, they had a problem. They didn't know how to deal with the South because they weren't familiar with the mindset of Southerners. Okay, we lost the war, but that doesn't mean we have to buckle under to the Union. All right? And there were a lot of things that happened during that time, especially when we start looking at how Southern states, in order to come back into the Union, had to rewrite their constitutions to give equality to freed blacks. And they just weren't going to do that. Louisiana was under Union control in 1864, and they had a constitutional convention, and they rewrote their constitution. But then again, we're going to see a lot of things that occurred were all for naught as far as the Republicans were concerned, because at the end of Reconstruction, the Republicans just gave up because they were concentrating on the Indians in the West with the expansion of the railroad. The Civil War left the South with a shattered economy, ruined farmland, destroyed buildings, grief from the loss of loved ones, grief and anger over the failure of the lost cause, general shock at the broad extent of destruction, and millions of freed slaves. The biggest problem for most families would be bare survival in the South because their economic base had been taken away with slaves and cotton. There were wartime experiments with free labor. Freed slaves worked on plantations for wages, or they were self-sufficient through a barter system. Now, what is a barter system? Pretend like I am a photographer, okay? And you are, say, you own a reception hall, and my daughter's getting married. and I really don't have the money to pay you, but I do have my skills as a photographer. So what it is you say, okay, look, I'll let you have the hall, I'll supply the food and all that stuff if you photograph weddings for free, a few weddings for free. So you're trading one service for another. That's a barter system. Lincoln proposed the 10% plan. It allowed former Confederate states to form new governments. He vetoed the Wade Davis bill, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on. And then the Freedmen's Bureau was organized, and that was a relief effort to organize small business loans for freed blacks and put together schools. Well, what happens is, like any other program, it wasn't funded properly, and a lot of money was wasted. President Johnson had an agenda from the South, and I'm going to tell you about President Johnson. President Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. Now, Lincoln chose him as his running mate because he thought that having a Southerner in his White House would allow healing to occur. But what he didn't know about Johnson was that Johnson was he hated slaveholders. He hated slaveholders. He was from the South. He was from Tennessee, but he hated slaveholders. So what he wanted to do was he wanted to modify Lincoln's 10% plan. The South quickly passed what was known as black codes, and it's instituted a system of near slavery. Now, what are black codes? Well, black codes are where freed blacks are not allowed to go out in public past a certain time. They're not allowed to be congregate anywhere. They're not allowed to carry firearms. That was a no-no. And those were black codes. So what are we doing? The South is trying to return to what occurred in antebellum days. They're not really allowing freed blacks to do anything. The Republicans were divided into three parts. They were the radicals, the moderates, but they were both angry. And this is what leads to radical Reconstruction. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get more flies with vinegar than honey. Okay, and it ain't going to happen because the South, even though it's been called the lost cause, that doesn't mean that they were going to give in totally to the Union, because the surrender that took place on April 9th, 1865, between General Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse was merely the military surrender. It wasn't the political surrender. So Southerners believed that they still had some sort of political power involved, and they were not going to buckle under to the North. Congress expands the rights in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, its Civil Rights Bill of 1866. Now, what does the 13th Amendment do? The 13th Amendment was designed to abolish slavery, okay? And it just abolished slavery for all time. Now, here's my point. And if you look at history, this is all fact, ladies and gentlemen. This is not conjecture. This is not opinion. If we look back at the Emancipation Proclamation that was basically effected on January 1st, 1863. In December of 1862, Lincoln was having a problem. The Union was not winning the war. They were losing men. And in order to gain more men, what he did was, at the behest of Frederick Douglass, is he freed the slaves in the states in open rebellion with the Union, which means the Confederate States. He freed them in the Confederate States. Well, as an historian, I have to ask the question, well, if you did that, why didn't you free them throughout the whole nation? So we often hear that the Union Army is fighting to end slavery, but slavery was still legal, and technically still legal in the North after 1863. So what are they fighting for? And if slavery was such an important issue, why did the North wait until, or the rest of the country wait until December of 1865, 8 months after the war was over, before they passed the 13th Amendment? Those are questions you have to ask yourself, okay? So when a lot of people say, well, it was over slavery, well, think about it. If it was over slavery, then Lincoln would have freed all the slaves throughout the whole nation instead of just in the South. And what that did was it brought a lot of emancipated slaves into the Northern Army. So there was no longer a manpower shortage. But A lot of times there was a lot of racism still in the Union Army, so a lot of times they used the black troops that were in the Union Army for manual labor. You see? Excuse me. Anyway, it was ratified by the states by the end of the year, and then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It was federal protection of individual rights. It was passed, then it was vetoed, and then the veto was overridden. Johnson was becoming defiant of aggressive federal protection of black civil rights. Even though he hated slaveholders, he still had a little bit of prejudice to him as well. The 14th Amendment was it gave freed slaves citizenship rights. The states were punished for denying these rights. Now, why was this important? Because if we go back before the war and we look at a major Supreme Court decision, which was the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The Supreme Court looked at this case. Now, what was this case about? Well, Dred Scott was a slave who belonged to an army officer, and the army officer traveled to a free territory. Therefore, Dred Scott said, well, wait a minute. If I'm a slave and I go to a free territory, then I'm free. So he sues the slaveholder, and the case goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, the court, in essence, ruled that Dred Scott did not have a right of action to sue because he was not a citizen of the United States. Now, this is interesting because you have slaves that are born in the United States, but they're not considered citizens because they didn't have rights. So the 14th Amendment was passed in order to grant citizenship to those freed slaves. Former Confederates could not hold public office under the 14th Amendment, and all the debts that were owed by the Confederacy were turned over. They didn't owe any money. All the debts had been erased. It was vetoed by Johnson, but it was finally adopted in 1868. Johnson believed the states should decide their issues of black suffrage. Now, what is suffrage? It's an interesting word. It means the right to vote. So a lot of Northerners moved south. Now, some of them were good, some of them were bad. They called them carpetbaggers. These were people they were investors that wanted to become planters in the staple crop economy in the South to try and build it up. There were Southerners who also Southerners saw them taking advantage of the South's devastation, and that's what they were doing. You had carpetbaggers and you had scallywags. Scallywags were initially people who were born in the South but supported the Union. They were reluctant secessionists who were allied with the Republicans. They were former Southern Whigs, and there were some humble planter class and less wealthy men. So you're looking at a lot of actually middle class who were looking to make an investment and become wealthy. It's also at this time, around 1867, we start to see political organizations. One of them was organized in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1867 by a former Confederate cavalry officer by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, you might not agree with what I'm going to say, but he was a fine cavalry officer. Problem was he was prejudiced and he was racist. But he organizes the Ku Klux Klan in 1867 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Now, what was this designed to do? This was designed first as a social club, but then they started turning violent. And even when they turned violent, Nathan Bedford Forrest said, I don't want to belong to it anymore, and he left the organization. But we started to see other organizations. In Louisiana, we had the Knights of the White Camellia. It was all the same thing. They were white supremacist groups. And basically what they were designed to do is suppress blacks from voting. That's what they were designed to do. This stuff about them stepping out of bounds with white people, that came a little bit later, but it was basically designed as a terrorist group to stop from blacks from voting. It began as Tennessee war veterans when they were wearing hoods that were later seen as ghosts of Confederate dead coming back from the dead to avenge their deaths. Everything was blamed on the emancipated slaves. It led to violence and murder of both blacks and whites allies. So it wasn't just confined to blacks. It showed how far ex-Confederates would go to reassert their authority. because they wanted, like I said in the beginning, they wanted to return to antebellum days, and they wanted to defy the federal government. Southerners have this inherent thing about, let's just go ahead and defy the federal government. They don't know us down here. They can't tell us what to do. This is what we do, man. This is how we've lived. How dare you tell us how we're supposed to live? This is a Freedmen's Bureau agents distributed rations to former slaves and Southern whites who had remained loyal to the Union. The agents also sponsored schools. They legalized marriages formed under slavery. Of course, then again, in slave days, during slavery, when two slaves married, they jumped the broom. That's what they called it. They jumped the broom and they were married. But it didn't prevent the slaveholder from selling one of them off to move far away. So what the Freedmen's Bureau wanted to do is they wanted to legalize these marriages amongst the slaves, arbitrated domestic disputes, and oversaw labor contracts between workers and landowners. The Bureau faced many challenges. It was chronically understaffed, and many freed people lived on isolated plantations far from the scrutiny of Bureau agents. But by 1869, the Bureau really had ceased to exist. So it was only in existence for about 3 years. This photo shows a Bureau office in Petersburg, Virginia. Even though there was an end, allegedly a legal end to slavery, there really wasn't. Because now freed blacks had to figure out, okay, how do I get an education? A lot of them didn't really leave the land that they had worked on for so long because that's all they knew. That's all they knew. How did voting patterns for Republicans evolve during the Reconstruction period? How did literacy tests differ between African Americans and Euro Americans in the South? That's an interesting question. And what was the land holding situation for African Americans at the end of the 19th century? Well, we're going to get to that. This is the History Lab, Struggle Over the South, that you can access if you want. It's online, but I'm going to give you all the information here, okay? Although Andrew Johnson stayed within the parameters Lincoln had disclosed prior to his assassination, executive reconstruction failed under Johnson's leadership. Now, why did it fail? Well, let me explain this to you. You've got somebody who wants to punish a particular segment of the population. It ain't going to work because your leadership is going to fail. Why? Because it becomes like an obsession with you. And everything they do is going to be wrong. It's not going to be right. The white South refused to act defeated. They exercised their right to vote. They elected high-level Confederate political and military officials to represent them in the National Congress. On the state level, again, they passed black codes to control every aspect of black life. So emancipated blacks were not emancipated, if you think about it. Of course, they didn't work for nothing anymore. They were very cheap labor. A lot of them were tied to the land. We're going to talk about, sharecropping and the crop lien system, because that's That's a very interesting topic, because what it did was it basically made the slaves, the former slaves again. They were tied to the land again and couldn't leave because now they were in monetary debt. But we'll get to that a little bit later. There were labor contracts. The Freedmen's Bureau would help negotiate. They have contract options, benefits of the contract. There was a mixed record on what happened because the agents were a diverse group. And some bureau offices were havens for blacks seeking help, but others had little impact. The contracts there was a monthly wage, there was a share of the crop, and there was a combination of that. Well, a lot of times these freed slaves had to go to what they call a company store. And these company stores were stores that were set on the plantation. And they had credit, okay? So basically what you would do is we're just going to use a name out of here. Jonathan, who was a freed slave, decides he wants to farm some land. Well, he's got to use his credit to buy farming utensils, seeds, okay, and a lot of other things like food, things of that nature. So he borrows against what his crop is going to be worth, not what it would be worth now. So say like the crop may be worth 150. So he goes in and he borrows, say, $250 in credit. Okay. Well, the crop comes back and it's only worth $100. So he's in debt $150 already. And in that instance, every planting season, he has to keep borrowing more and more money until he's deep in debt. And he will never get out of it. That is slavery. It's debt slavery. Benefits of a contractor: incentive to treat workers fairly, and workers could leave at the end of the year. General Sherman came up with an order called 40 acres and a mule. It was later revoked. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to give slaves land, former slaves, land that belonged to former slaveholders, and then give them a mule and say, here, this is what you need to do. This is how you're going to make some money. This is how you're going to support your family. It didn't work. The commissioners from Edisto Island, group of black men protested at that. There was a sharecropping option, which was troubling for freedmen, and I'll tell you why. We talked about that credit thing where they would get further into what they call debt peonage, is what it's called. And so when they did this, they also wanted to get into sharecropping. What does that mean? Well, they share crop profits with the owner of the land, but a lot of times they would get, frankly, screwed. All right. So they'd still have to work the land, but they couldn't share a lot of the profit. It was all, it was gauged. It was gauged toward the people that owned the land rather than the people that worked the land. They received advance supplies from their landlord, worked all year, and remained indebted to the landlord and obliged to work for another year because they kept getting deeper and deeper in debt. They could be easily evicted if the landlord desired. So this doesn't work. Okay. It's a new form of slavery. And it was very sneaky how the South put it in there. Hey, look, you can't leave the land. Well, I'll tell you what, this is what we're going to do. We'll give you a shack. We'll give you some land to produce, and you work this other land for us, and we'll share the profits with that. They found a way to get screwed. Okay. They found a way to screw over the freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau was assigned to help former slaves assume full citizenship rights in the South. It failed in this task. The task itself was too large. There were too few staff members assigned to address the needs of so many. The budget was too small, and active and passive resistance efforts by white Southerners were very effective. Okay, so you have this thing that's very effective by the Southerners. And there's a question. Why did sharecropping become an important element of Southern farm labor? Because it put blacks back into bondage, economic bondage. And that was important for the former Confederates and the people that lived in the South, because they blamed the blacks, the freed blacks, because of that. They blamed them for the war, their loss in the war. So now they've got them back working again in the South. The blacks strove to be a political force. They were often divided by class. The uniting principle was that they were American citizens because of the 14th Amendment. They were granted citizenship. There were self-help organizations. There were efforts to sponsor schools, family cooperation, build their own churches, and whites felt very threatened by this. They did not want blacks to become a political voice in Southern politics. It's very simple. Now, here's a map where it talks about, now 1867, there was, the Military Act was passed, and what it did was it divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts. We were in the 5th military district, okay? And what happened was, this was designed basically to have a military governor for each particular district. And what they did was they said, okay, if you want to come back into the Union, then you have to write a new constitution that provides for the suffrage of freed blacks. And a lot of Southern states were very resilient against this. They did not want to put this into their constitutions, but those were the terms. As freedmen, slaves traveled extensively trying to reunite families and visit old friends. Some traveled just to prove they were free to do so, but returned to their home plantations. Most, however, had no desire to work on their former masters' plantations, but then again, they weren't given a choice. Black families were determined to stay together, and many men worked to allow the mother to remain at home to raise their families. Southern whites resented this decision to keep women out of the labor force, viewing it as insulting and illegal. Were Northern and Southern racists accurate in their assessment of the inability of blacks to earn a living, care for their families, pay for their debts, or properly use their freedom? Well, a racist is going to see that. But if you give somebody an education, if you show them how to do something, if you train them, then they'll know how to do that. But the South wasn't willing to do that. So these claims are kind of disingenuous as far as Southern racists making these claims. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 was to purge the South of disloyalty. It stripped Confederates of voting rights, so they couldn't vote. People who fought in the Confederate Army could not vote anymore. Former Confederate states were not readmitted until they ratified the 14th Amendment and wrote new constitutions that guaranteed black men the right to vote. They were, like I said, they were divided into 5 military districts, which we saw in that map, and I'll bring it back. Okay, if you look at the map, you can tell where the United States, the southern United States, was divided. And if you look at the legend, it'll tell you, Reconstruction, abolition of slavery. And you see that, like I said, the southern states are very, very resilient to any type of change. In fact, to this day. The 5 military districts, federal troops were stationed throughout the territory, protecting Union personnel and supporters and restoring order. The Tenure of Office Act was to prevent the president from dismissing Secretary of War Edmund M. Stanton, who was the Secretary of War and a supporter of the radical reconstructions. Johnson was impeached for violation of the Tenure Act. He was one vote short of impeachment, and Johnson no longer attempted policy making. Okay, let me explain this to you, okay? Because you are impeached does not mean you're convicted. Okay, that just means you have been indicted on something in the House. If you indict somebody, and we saw over this past few months, this was passed to make it difficult for Confederates to vote people in who were part of the Confederate problem. Command of the Army Act, the president must seek approval for military orders from General Grant. Grant was also a supporter of the radicals. Reconstruction governments. Now, we're going to see the blacks for the first time in American history voted into office, in national office and state offices. Reconstruction governments, 2,000 black men, Republican leaders passed laws to improve equality. The 15th Amendment is very important. It's all part of that series of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Voting rights for black men, and it outlawed the Ku Klux Klan. But that didn't do any good. Why? Because all of these amendments that were passed by the National Congress were totally ignored by former Confederate states. They were ignored. And eventually we would see, like in Louisiana, there was a great power struggle in Louisiana in the early 1870s, and there was a formation of a group called the White League in Louisiana. They were basically a terrorist group. Of course, from the name, of course, White League, you know what happened. There was a presidential election, and Ulysses S. Grant, the former general, won basically a landslide. He won 214 electoral votes to Horatio Seymour's 80. But it was a kind of a turning point because it demonstrated that democratic ideals such as racism and prejudice against blacks was not accepted in states. That's why Grant won. Now, Grant's administration would later become one of the most corrupt in American history, but that's another story. The Republican Congress refused to recognize the Southern elected officials and launched its own Reconstruction program. So went from presidential Reconstruction to congressional, now we're going into radical Reconstruction. Johnson and Congress clashed so many times over Reconstruction issues that Congress finally began impeachment proceedings. So it wasn't just because he went against this particular order and he wanted to get rid of a particular person. It was because he saw that it was they weren't doing what he wanted them to do, basically, is what was going on. So when we look at radical Reconstruction, the impeachment process failed to secure the necessary votes. After the midterm congressional elections, Republicans had sufficient votes in both houses to override the presidential veto. So now whatever law he vetoes, they can override the veto. The North won the military aspect of the war, and this is what I keep saying is, did they also win back the hearts and minds of the South? No, they didn't. You got to look at it from a perspective as you are a family and people are fighting. You have members of your family fighting in an army that has the strong beliefs that you have. Now, what are these beliefs? Well, it's protecting home. It really has nothing to do with slavery because only 0.1% of the Confederate Army owned slaves. So what was the other 90-something% fighting for? They weren't fighting to maintain slavery. They were fighting for their homes. One particular instance, a Confederate soldier, a Confederate grunt infantry soldier, was captured by the Union. And he was in an interrogation, and the Union soldier asked him, "Hey, Johnny Reb, why are you fighting?" And Johnny Reb said, "Because you're down here. That's why." Okay? So it has to do with protection of home. The North, under President Lincoln, they were the first ones to send troops into the South. That actually ignited the war. But anyway, evaluate the quality of freedom former slaves gained through Republican legislation. Well, here's the deal. Laws are only good if they're obeyed. And the Southerners did not obey the laws. So consider the problems addressed during Reconstruction. Was congressional Reconstruction more successful than presidential Reconstruction in solving these problems? Okay, number one, if you're going to solve a problem, you can't throw money at it. If you throw money at a problem, that doesn't solve it. You have to have active legislation. And you also have to have the compliance of the people that you're making the laws for. And they didn't have that. Military campaigns begin against the Indians in the West. Why? Because focus was shifting from the South to the West because railroads, which bring a lot of money, were starting to head west, and a lot of the land in the West was still occupied by Indians. There was a post-war Western labor problem, and there was land use in an expanding nation. They wanted to buy territory. But what happens is the United States government speaks to the Native Americans in forked tongue. That means they speak out of both sides of their face. So they're making agreements with the Indians, while a week later they're breaking them. Okay? Post-bellum migration, a lot of Southerners, a lot of freed blacks actually went to the West because they thought that there wasn't going to be any prejudice out there. But then they start running into Chinese immigrants who were they were suffering from racism and prejudice, and they were just lumped into that group. Native Americans battled the U.S. cavalry in the Northwest, in the Plains, and in the Southwest because Native Americans, and I teach this in my American History 1 class, if I ever get to teach it again, that the Native Americans believed the land belonged to everyone. It didn't have one owner. And so they were fighting for that principle a lot of the times, and a lot of times they were hunting grounds. We start to see the disappearance of the buffalo. That's a food thing. Now, Indians don't waste anything back then, the Native Americans. They would take the buffalo meat, they'd take the bones, they would make weapons, they would make needles for sewing, they would take the hides and make coverings for teepees and, outfits to make through the winter. So you're looking at a wholesale destruction of a people, again, in the West by the American government. Now, this is an office of the Kansas Pacific Railway in the West, and that was the big movement after Reconstruction. Now, let me stop here for a second and say, okay, well, what happened to the blacks in the South, the freed blacks in the South? What did the government do? They basically abandoned them to the Southern governments, and that was not successful. That's why I always say Reconstruction was terrible. It was not successful. How do you solve that problem? Well, you can't get people to the table to agree on anything, so, a lot of them didn't even try. There were clashes on the plains between the Native Americans and American troops. In 1867, there was the Medicine Lodge Creek Treaty between the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Apache. The Indians continued to attack workers associated with the railroad because it was a threat to their land. And surveyors and supply caravans had to have military exports. Custer, General George Armstrong Custer, which we will later see him killed at Little Bighorn, attacks the Washita River Cheyenne. 7th Cavalry formed to ward off Indian attacks and murdered women and children and burned teepees and destroyed 800 horses. So this was a scorched earth policy by the United States government against the Indians, is basically what happened. Custer in the Black Hills in 1874, land supposedly off limits to whites from a treaty, but they went on it anyway. Offer support to surveyors of railroad and force Indians into the reservations. There was a land rush after gold reported in the Black Hills. 15,000 miners went to the Black Hills, South Dakota. They were killed off a lot by the Native Americans too because they were encroaching on their land. The government tried to buy the land. Well, the Indians didn't want to sell it, so the United States government decided, hey, we're just going to take it from you. And that's what happened. In 1875, General Crook captures Geronimo. The Apache leader offered religious and military guidance to his people. In 1876, General George Armstrong Custer, who was the boy general from the Civil War, I believe he was 21 years old. He was what they call a brevet brigadier general. That's 1 star, and it was a temporary rank. But then he was promoted to a later rank after the war. When he got older, he wore kind of his own uniform. He had long blonde hair, and he was very arrogant. And he decided that, okay, we're going to take these Indians in Little Bighorn. Attacks were about 2,500 Sioux and Cheyenne, and he only had 264 soldiers. It was a massacre. The U.S. military reduced Lakota and Cheyenne to wardship status, ending their autonomy. So Indians did not have any autonomy, which means the right to govern themselves. Horses maintained their culture with breaking horses and a trading system. Okay, so we see the American government goes out there, and even though Custer lost the battle, the military sequestered all these Indians, Native Americans, to go on reservations. And when we look at reservations later on in history, we notice that they had a high incidence of unemployment. They had a high illiteracy rate, out of wedlock marriages, alcoholism, and drugs until the latter part of the 20th century when they had casinos. Indian reservations had casinos, kind of the joke on the white man because they're making a lot of money now, you see, and they have influence. The Union Army used total warfare to defeat independent Indian tribes and force them to move to reservations. Tribes faced great hardship trying to preserve their ways of life. In the end, Indian leaders accepted the reservation in order to ease the suffering of women, children, and the elderly. Now, why was the Union Army able to move independent tribes into reservations and protect white settlers in developing Western lands? Well, we're going to see something that happened a little bit later where the Indians developed what's called the ghost dance. And that was a cult that came out of the suppression of Native Americans by white people. And there was a massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 where men, women, and children were all massacred by the United States Army. It kind of sends a message when you do that to other Indians that if you resist, this is what's going to happen to you. But they were able to move these independent tribes onto reservations and protect white settlers in developing Western lands because the Indians learned that, hey, we're fighting a losing battle right now. You know, it's better to live and fight another day than die. And that's what they did. The railroad labor force was composed of Irish labor, which began a rail line in California, and also spoke of Chinese immigrants that came over. Gold was an enticement to leave. Chinese laborers brought work to railroads and proved to be very skillful workers. They worked very, very hard. Railroad work was hard and dangerous. The Chinese sought work elsewhere when the railroad was complete. The Burlingame Treaty was protection for Chinese immigrants, and it did not prevent discrimination. There were lynchings of blacks, of Jews. There were lynchings of whites. In the West, there was lynching of Mexicans and Chinese. There was a massacre that took place in California. Some Chinese were killed out there trying to pan for gold. White workers felt competition was unfair. Most Chinese immigrants were men. They worked in many areas, factories, gold mining towns, as laundry operators and agricultural laborers. The Californian Native Americans, Their population was decimated, their land was taken, and they were often forced to work as wage earners for large landowners. This was a systematic, planned move. The less Indians they had, the less problems they had in the West, according to what whites believed. Chinese construction workers in this image labor on the Central Pacific Railroad around 1868. Many Chinese immigrants toiled as indentured laborers, indebted to Chinese merchant creditors who paid for their passage to California. Isolated in all-male work camps, crews of railroad workers retained their traditional dress, language, and diet. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, some immigrants returned to China and others dispersed to small towns and cities throughout the West because they wanted to make a living for themselves. They opened up restaurants, they opened up bars, laundromats, things of that nature. Now, a lot of Chinese women came over here who didn't have a lot of work to do, and they were forced into prostitution. Did racism disappear in the freedom from effective political and social restraints seen in the West? No. No, there wasn't any political freedom at all, especially for new immigrants, especially for blacks that had migrated to California, freed blacks that migrated there. And, of course, number one on the list to hate, Native Americans. But that list would change when we start to see immigration, intense immigration of Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Northern European immigrants around the turn of the 20th century. The use of land in the South moved to mining and forests for commodities, and there were complementary labor plantings. So when they moved, they went for commodities such as phosphate, timber, coal, and turpentine. There was spring tilling, fall harvesting, sawmills, coal mines in winter and summer, use of the land in the West and the Southwest. Courts favor European American land claims over black land claims. Santa Fe Ring, 80% of the land was confiscated from Hispanics. Boom towns, minerals and timber, southern Arizona, Virginia City, Rocky Mountains, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. Railroads benefited mining and ranching. There were cattle drives. We're starting to see an excessive need, a consumer need for meat and beef. This is around the time when they start to develop the refrigerated rail cars to where meat could be slaughtered in one place and transported to another place without spoiling. Cowboys drive herds to railroad for shipment to stockyards in Chicago or St. Louis, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, and Ellsworth. Dallas was also a big place for cattle drives. African Americans made up 25%, Hispanos about 15% of cowboys. In the Mineral Act of 1872, it legalized traditional mining practices. Well, there was a guy named John Muir. Now, what this does is it validates titles approved by local courts, and it located the apex of a vein of gold, could lay claim to the whole vein beneath the surface. So it wasn't, just on one particular piece of the vein of gold, they could claim the whole thing. It was destruction of whole areas as mining companies blasted through mountains. John Muir explored California, and he got painters and geologists to come out west to explore the landscape. Okay, this was, if you remember back from your American history, there was the Lewis and Clark expedition. A lot of times people would read stories about these expeditions, and they would go out west, and you see these artists and these writers and all this stuff. They become very, very inspired by the sites that a lot of parts of the West had not been explored and not been settled yet. We start to see the development of a national park system, set aside beautiful areas that could not be commercially developed, and this is where we get Yellowstone Park. And of course, later on, we have a lot of parks around the United States. This is a chart that shows the estimate of railroad cross ties used in acres of forests cleared. Of course, they were used by wood. They used wood as these cross things that go underneath the rails of the track. You see the crossed wood. You can see them on railroads now. This is just showing you how much it increased, the deforestation increased. At the end of the Civil War, the increasing number of European Americans in the West gave them the power to ignore Mexican land grants and the provisions in Indian treaties protecting Indian land, water, and wildlife rights. So now you have new Europeans coming over here, And what they do is they exploit land rights because they know they weren't part of the treaty to begin with. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad proved a valuable link in uniting the East to the West Coast and encouraged town building and agricultural development in the interior territory. In 1867, Alaska was purchased from Russia. They called this Seward's Folly for $7.2 million. There were indigenous peoples, the Eskimo, the Aleut, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, Athabaskan, and Haida. There's also be another tribe up north called the Nunavut, and they would later be their own province up there. Fish, timber, minerals, oil, and water power in later years. Yes, Alaska was a plentiful society when it came to natural resources, but they also have earthquakes, and the weather is very cold up there. The United States attempted to acquire the Dominican Republic. It would provide a naval base and investment and a refuge for Southern freemen. Senator Charles Sumner considered the will of the Dominicans when he did that. Now, later on, we're going to see this rise to globalism where the United States thinks that they have to get colonies in order to become a world power. And so, and we're going to get to that a little bit later when we talk about the Spanish-American War. The Republican principle was that hard workers received prosperity except in cases of the Native Americans. So everyone could work hard, but it didn't matter if the Native Americans did. The postbellum origins of the women's suffrage movement, workers' organizations, and political corruption and the decline of Republican idealism. This was kind of a turning point for the people of the United States because they realized there's a lot of corruption in government. Ring a bell? Okay. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to make it more fair. Now, women had been trying to get the right to vote ever since really the Constitution was signed or ratified in the early 1790s. But did they really have rights? Women did not have rights. They weren't considered, they weren't considered equal. They didn't have the right to vote. And their voices started to be heard. And the reason being is because they suffered violence at the hands of some alcoholic men. They were not treated as citizens. They were expected to stay in the kitchen and have children. That's it. Cook, clean, and have babies. The Republican vision was that all citizens were free to pursue economic self-interest, going by the principles of laissez-faire that Jefferson first mentioned in writings in the late 18th century, where he starts talking about, let the economy do what it does. We need workers. We need agrarian workers as well to do this. Groups organized to bring about rights: women, industrial workers, farmers, and African Americans. Later on, we're going to see 1913 National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We're going to start to see farmers' alliances, Southern alliances, black alliances. These are all farmers who got together and formed somewhat of a commune. Didn't exactly work out later in the century. There were partnerships between business and government. There was a lot of corruption and greed. Of course, there's always corruption and greed when there's money involved, right? Middle-class Victorians and domestic ideal. There was a similar movement in England where women wanted the right to vote. And this idea of domesticity. Now, the cult of domesticity came out in the first Industrial Revolution, where women actually educated children who were staying home. And they were feeding their men. The men were bringing home money from the factories, and women were expected to be there. They were expected to raise the children, educate the children, and tend to her husband, in a manner of speaking. Some women desire life outside of the home. In 1866, there was the Equal Rights Association. And in 1869, there was the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women Suffrage Association. So women wanted a political voice, okay? Some Americans prospered and some did not. Farmers and factory managers make a very comfortable living. Agricultural and manufacturing workers face growing debt. Farmers borrowed to rebuild from the war. They were forced to grow cotton because it was a real quick crop. They received credit for the payment, and then you have this constant cycle of debt. Okay? Constant cycle of debt. And we still see it actually today. There is a constant, debt. Let me see where I found it. Oh, yeah. Farmers, buy equipment and technology. Alternative for farmers was in 1867, the Grange. It addressed the market dominated by industry and railroads, because what would happen is the price of transporting produce to market would rise. And farmers can't pay this because they only have a certain amount of produce that they can give. And so they were encouraged to form what's called the Grange and later farmers' alliances, where they would get into cooperatives. Now, what are cooperatives? It's where a bunch of farmers get together. No matter how much you produce the most or the least, you throw it all into a pile, and whatever you get for that, you split it evenly. That's not even, all right? But it looked like that was going to be a way for them all to survive any type of depression or anything of that nature. What were the alternatives for workers? National labor unions. There was a nationwide depression, the National Knights of Labor, and the Greenback Labor Party. You start to see political parties rise because of particular situations that are occurring in the country at that particular time. Multicultural workforce proved to be a challenge because whites and blacks didn't get along, right? And people were kind of anti-immigrant after a while because they start seeing all these immigrants flood into the country and taking jobs. Discrimination, a lot of discrimination. We're going to see, especially in Louisiana, and I'm not bragging about this, but I wrote a book called Italian Louisiana. If you go online, it's there. I also wrote a couple of books on true crime, murders that occurred, true stuff. But I learned through my research that it wasn't about, like, for instance, the Italians were invited over here because Southern planters perceived a labor shortage when blacks were freed from the Civil War. So they figured, why don't we get some people over here that are physiologically alike the slaves, where they have this makeup that they work in hot conditions. So the Mediterranean was the obvious choice. And they went over there and they invited the Italians and the Sicilians to come over here. But the problem was Italians and Sicilians did not have the prejudices that whites had. See, not only did they want a workforce, whites want a workforce, they wanted to supplement the white population. And it didn't happen. So then Italians started exhibiting prejudice. And if you want to read it, go out and buy it. That's fine. I'm not telling you to go buy it, but if you want to go buy it, you can. It's allegedly, I'm not supposed to hawk anything I do like that. But you know what? It comes in handy when you're understanding American history. We start to see a lot of investigative journalism. There's a guy named Boss Tweed in Tammany Hall, New York, corrupt political organization. No one would get elected unless they recommended this person to the voters. And there was voter fraud and all kinds of things. Union Railroad Pacific Railroads came up with the Credit Mobilier, which was a bank that gave out a lot of credit. Okay, problem. Horace Greeley runs as a Democrat in 1872. In 1875, there's another Civil Rights Act passed where it guaranteed equal access to government, but it was declared unconstitutional in 1883. In 1876, we saw the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Now, if you look at this cartoon, you're going to see, this is, in 1871, Thomas Nast drew a series of cartoons exposing the corruption of New York City Democratic boss William M. Tweed and his political organization, Tammany Hall. In this drawing, published in Harper's Weekly in 1871, Nast depicts Tweed and his cronies engaging in a, quote, wholesale, end quote, looting of the New York City Treasury with the assistance of compliance police officers. Not only were the politicians corrupt, but law enforcement was corrupt as well. Those same officers stand ready to crack down on the impoverished father who robs a bakery to feed his family. By portraying Tweed as an enemy of the poor, Nash ignored the fact that the political boss gained a large following among immigrant voters, because what you do is you promise the masses you're going to do something, you get elected, and you do a little bit, okay? And then you blame the wheels of politics for the reason why they didn't get what they elected you for. Ulysses S. Grant ran again. Oh, actually, this is 1872. In 1868, he ran. We saw that before. And then in 72, he ran again and won by a big margin. And like I said, his later administration would be extremely corrupt. Now, in the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, you see that? Okay. This is an example of someone winning the popular vote but losing the Electoral College. Tilden lost by 1 vote. Samuel Tilden was the governor of New York, Democratic reformer who would battle against Tammany Hall and Tweed Ring. Tilden was won a popular vote majority and appeared to have enough electoral votes for victory except for 20 disputed votes. To settle the dispute, Congress created a commission of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats who voted along party lines to give Hayes all 20 votes and a narrow electoral college victory, 185 to 184. Outraged Democrats protested the outcome and threatened to stop the Senate from officially counting the electoral votes, preventing Hayes' inauguration. As the March 4th inauguration date approached, under the Grant motto of, quote, peace at any price, end quote, the forces of mutual self-interest concluded the Compromise of 1877. On March 2nd, Hayes was declared president-elect while Tilden conceded the election in his speech soon thereafter. So what we see is that, basically summing up, Reconstruction did not work that well. New prejudices or old prejudices were renewed with the Indians and immigrants, and there's going to be considerable controversy when we start getting into immigration. We're going to start getting into political movements and also the Gilded Age we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'll see you guys at the next lecture.